Florida leaders calling on President Joe Biden to intervene in Cuba. This comes after days of protests across the state, including right here in Jacksonville, from people demanding freedom for Cubans from communism. On your sides, Kaylee Tracy's live in the newsroom with more. Kaylee?
Governor Ron DeSantis and the FCC commissioner were joined by other state leaders calling for the president to beam wireless internet to Cuba to boost the access to free information there. The Cuban government cut off access to the internet there a few days ago. Yesterday, DeSantis sent a letter to President Biden asking for federal help to bring internet access to Cubans who are, quote, standing up against communist oppression and demanding a voice after decades of suffering. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr says balloons would carry a transmitter that would be put into the air for a few days. When it comes back down, another one would then go up. And Carr and DeSantis specifically asked President Biden to give support for American businesses to deliver internet services.
And one of the most effective things we can do as a country, and we need President Biden to step up to make this happen. And I spoke with the FCC Commissioner Carr on the phone. We can be able to be helpful to getting internet back onto the island of Cuba. The one thing that communist regimes fear the most is the truth.
The governor also today called on Cuban American protesters not to block roadways like we saw in Miami, Tampa, Orlando, and Jacksonville this week.
Tracy, thank you.